Hello, everyone, and welcome to this radcast of the Social Club at the End of the World. This week, we're doing something different from social clubs in the past, where we are actually breaking up the social club into three different hourly, 1 hour chunks. This first one is on refreezing the Arctic from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Actually, we got started a few minutes after the hour. It's 10:09 Pacific right now. So from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Pacific, we'll do refreezing the Arctic. Then we'll break for about 5 minutes, and then I'll launch another Hangout with a whole new link to join and everything, and that will be on Radical Collective Intelligence. That'll go from 11 to 12. And then from 12 to 1, again, we'll stop at noon for about 5 minutes. I'll send out a whole new link. From 12 to 1, we'll do a new story for humanity will be the topic. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to our online viewers. And I just want to remind everyone is welcome to join by clicking on the link to join, which you can find either on my Facebook page or my Google Plus page. And I want to welcome our guests. We have Adam from Olympia, Washington. We have Dan from Chicago, and we've got Michael in the south of France. How y'all doing today, gentlemen? And welcome.
Doing great. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you. Good to be here.
All right.
Good to see everybody. I can report that we had snow yesterday in Chicago, so the weird weather patterns have definitely continued where I am.
Wow. Yeah, weird weather all around. Flooding in Yosemite, hurricanes in the Midwest, storms, snow, and even some hurricane activity I hear on the East Coast. So weird weather everywhere, but the major media is not covering it because that's not really their job. Their job is to make money for the oligarchs and for themselves. So we're going to jump in with the topic of refreezing the Arctic. And what I thought we'd do is basically use the brain swarming method that I talk about in the introductory videos on Radical Collective Intelligence. So you are all quite familiar with that. And so let me kick it off. I'll do a screen share. Please just jump in if you have anything to say, because I can't see you while I'm screen sharing. But just jump in. Okay. All right. So just as we do with the brain swarming method, we put the goal at the top. The goal is to refreeze the Arctic. And what I'm going to do is I'll probably list the main sub goals. I'll probably just list them like this, kind of make well, actually I call them ways to refreeze the Arctic. What I'll probably do is kind of make a list of the main ways here on this screen, and then in other screens I'll break them down into subways. So main ways to refreeze the Arctic, we can just make a list, and just feel free to jump in with any ways that you think of, and we can add to this list later. So I'm just going to be the scribe. Normally you guys would be posting your ideas with post-it notes on a big whiteboard here, but since we can't do that at the moment, I'll just be the scribe. Yes, go ahead.
Tim, and perhaps before we explore solutions, possible solutions, ways and means and so forth, do you think it would be beneficial to talk about the need to refreeze the Arctic, or do you think it's just so obvious that's
a good point? That's a good point. We won't go into too much detail on it because we covered it in other videos, but the basic idea the basic need and urgency is that the Arctic, well, first of all, the context is climate change, and specifically abrupt climate change. And the main characteristic is increased warming. We've got warming going on all over the planet at a planetary scale. And that's what's causing the weird weather, the wild weather, the hurricanes, the droughts, the storms, the flooding, the wildfires, too much heat. So we need to cool the planet. That's the big headline. We need to cool the planet. And year after year, the Arctic ice has been melting and melting and melting, and to the point that we may have an ice-free Arctic as soon as this summer. And if not this summer, for sure next summer. But regardless of when it happens, it would be absolutely catastrophic, because what the Arctic ice performs are two vital functions. Number one, it's like a giant mirror. It is a giant mirror that in the summer months, spring, summer, and fall, it reflects away sunlight that hits it back into space. And that helps keep the planet cooler. And the second function is it's basically like a massive bank account of ice, so that when there is surplus heat in the northern hemisphere, like in the summer months, it melts and melts and melts whatever ice it needs to melt, because it's got a big bank account. Well, now that bank account is shrinking almost to zero. And if we lose both the mirror and the bank account of ice, all bets are off for survival of humanity and most other complex life on planet Earth, because that would kick off cascading events such as the release of this predicted 50 gigaton burst of methane, which would heat the planet substantially, and other self-reinforcing feedback loops, whether they're wildfires, burning forest, reducing Earth's capacity to absorb carbon and emitting a lot more carbon into the atmosphere, crop failures leading to societal collapse, which would spell the end of global dimming, which is another thing that's keeping us alive by keeping the planet artificially cool because of all the particulates. So bottom line, we cannot afford to lose the Arctic ice. And rather than lose the Arctic ice, what our objective is to actually refreeze. When I say refreeze the Arctic, I mean accumulate much more ice by causing the Arctic region to be much cooler than it would otherwise be. And so we'll talk about ways to do that on the whiteboard here. But is that a good enough intro? Anything anyone wants to add to that? Go on mute.
I just want to add a couple of things just to elaborate. So the Arctic ice, in addition to deflecting radiation from the sun back out into space, it serves as a cover for the methane hydrates, frozen methane gas that exists in the shallow seabed, I think on the eastern Arctic side of the ocean. And this is really critical, because methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, much more powerful, I guess, depending on how long it's up there, anywhere from 20 times to 100 times more powerful molecule to molecule compared to carbon dioxide. So that ice is protecting from the methane. And just even though when we say refreeze the Arctic, we're talking about the ocean area, that shallow continental shelf where the 50 gigaton burst could be released from. But we also want to note that there's maybe 170 to 200 gigatons of methane contained in the permafrost areas that are on land. And these have started to leak pretty already. And nobody thinks that if something isn't done, whether they project out to 2026, 2030, 2050, 2100, we can't afford to have this kind of heating take place. Massive releases of methane will be worse than a disaster. So it is essential, to kind of do it now.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Michael. All right. So with that, shall we kick off the brain swarming method? So how to refreeze the Arctic? And of course, our challenge is made that much greater because we're losing the albedo effect of the ice. The ice that's there is greatly diminished. So we're in a bit of a losing battle to begin with, because we don't have the reflectivity that we used to have.
Is that the albedo effect?
Yeah. The albedo effect is the sunlight that used to be reflected away, because we had basically a bigger mirror. I'll just draw a little sketch of it right up here. When the mirror was big, it would reflect away a lot more sunlight back into space. But as the mirror shrinks, then we're no longer able to reflect away that portion of sunlight, only that which hits the mirror. And that which used to be reflected away is now being absorbed by dark blue ocean water, and that just causes more heating. It adds to the heat load.
Which is one of the main factors which is causing the Arctic to melt exponentially, right?
Exactly.
And so, and there are some other feedback loops. I mean, there's a lot of feedback loops, but that's one of the main ones, if not the main one, that's contributing to this this mass acceleration of melting.
Exactly. Yep, that's it. So let's talk about ways in which we could refreeze the Arctic. So one of the main ways is, I'm just going to call it human-made reflecting systems that we make and install up in the Arctic to do the same job of reflecting, but instead of with ice or with with the Arctic ice, it's with something else. So for example, just imagine a giant mirror here, and we'll talk about that. That's what we're talking about. Now, what could this mirror be made of? That's where we can branch it. That's where we can branch it out. In fact, let me do that on the next screen here. So I'll just put reflection of sunlight, right? How do we cause reflection of sunlight? And here I'll break it into the normal brain swarming format, where I'll branch it down from here. One way of reflecting sunlight that I've mentioned on previous Hangouts is using thin film reflective material. Okay. Another way to reflect away sunlight would be creating what you could call artificial clouds by spraying ocean water into the atmosphere. Okay, so now the thin film reflective material, how might we actually do that? This is the one that I've been focused on a lot. A lot of people have talked about, in fact, Peter Wadhams talked about, and Paul Beckwith have talked about this sort of spraying method, and that it can be quite effective and that it wouldn't necessarily be that costly. The basic idea there is, imagine you've got some ship out there in the Arctic Ocean that has, massive pumps and the ability to basically spray all this ocean water way up into the sky. And that clouds up. All those droplets form these white clouds, and these white clouds are reflective. So they do the job of bouncing that sunlight back into space. The thin film reflective material takes a different approach and says, rather than continually spraying all these droplets up into the sky in the daytime hours, of course, they fall back down at night. So you always have to keep respraying them. Thin film reflective material says, hey, why don't we, using our technologies of mass producing inexpensive thin film materials that have a thin coating. The coating can be 10 atoms thick of, say, molecules of iron, for example. So it can be very, very thin and very economical to do, so that the thin film itself reflects away the sunlight. But then the question is, how do you support that, right? These clouds are self-supporting. You spray them up there and they just hang out and do the job. But for thin film reflective material, how would we support it? How do we keep it in place? And so some of the options there that we've talked about include having massive thin film sheets, kilometers wide by kilometers long, and suspend them by blimps. And it can be a whole constellation of blimps, not just on the corners, but even in the middle, wherever you need to basically pull upward on the system to keep it intact. So that's one way. I'll just put blimps here. Blimps suspend the reflective sheet. Another way would be with buoys. And I'm kind of excited about this idea, frankly. Imagine you've got the Arctic Ocean here, and then, every, few hundred feet or so would be a buoy with whatever system it would require underneath and on the sides to keep it stable. So it'd be a stable buoy, and whether it's done with automatic mechanical systems or sophisticated electrical controls, I don't know. I'm not a buoy expert, but whatever the case, you would have these buoys with these masts that would basically hold up the corners and the middles of these giant thin film reflective sheets. So you'd have buoys every whatever distance around the edges and in the middle, holding up the thin film, right, at whatever points. So, that's another option. In addition to buoys, another option that's just been kicked around at the theoretical level are basically floating spheres, right? I'll just call it that, floating spheres. These spheres could, just think like, like little ping pong balls, but they could be the size of ping pong balls. They could be 100 times bigger. They could be 100 times smaller. So I'm not specifying what size. I'm just saying the general concept. Rather than, having these massive sheets to do the reflection, it would basically be, here's your ocean water and, a whole bunch of spheres that are literally bumping into each other to just cover the ocean surface with reflective spheres. I don't know whether they be white color or metallic color or whatever, but we're just exploring creative ways of how do we bounce that sunlight back into space, right?
Hey, Jamie.
Hey,
yes, yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Adam.
Are you aware that Switzerland is doing an experiment right now that where they're using pumps on a glacier in Switzerland that's receding at something like 50 or 60 meters a day, and maybe it's receding fast, but they're using pumps to pump water over the, well, actually like ice pellets over the glacier. And so it adds to the volume of the glacier. And they're talking about, and I looked this up on the internet here before this, and they're talking about using this system in the Arctic and they're talking about using wind turbines to pump the seawater up and spray it over the ice where it freezes and adds to the ice. So that's another method.
Wow, that's interesting. That's really interesting. So they're spraying these droplets so that they'll freeze in the air and then land as ice crystals, basically, on top of existing ice.
That's my understanding. Yes, I have it actually. It says. Based on calculations of wind speed in the Arctic, they calculate that a wind turbine with a 6-meter diameter blades would generate sufficient energy so that a single pump could raise water to a height of 7 meters. And the net effect would be thicker sheets of ice in the entire affected area, which would have a better chance of surviving the summer.
Could I follow up on what you're saying, Adam? I think I saw something about that. I can't remember whether I was, looking for something or it just came across my screen. But one of the things that was emphasized in the book Drawdown, which talks about all these different ways to draw down the greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, and I'm sure most of you have seen that book. So it breaks it down into kind of how long, what is the time frame that it would take to have this intervention implemented, how effective would it be, and how costly would it be? So you have kind of those three variables: time span, cost, and effectiveness. And one of the things with that, the idea of pumping that seawater was, correct me if I'm wrong, and I don't even, I thought I saw something where that indicated the time span and the possibly the cost of getting everything in place. What was perhaps feasible if we actually have a long time span, and maybe more than one intervention is going to be necessary, to do this. But it seems like we ought to break these things down at some point in like a drawdown style. What is the cost? How long will it really take to get it in place so it can do some good? And then how effective is it? And to have some comparisons of the various intervention strategies. Just wanted to throw that out there. I'm going to mute out.
There's another method that Paul Beckwith talked about, and I have a picture up on my screen of the Arctic, but I'm not sure how to put it in the place of my face.
Yeah. Can I give you a tip on how to do that, Adam?
Sure.
Okay. So if you move your mouse around on the screen, actually, I'm not sure if it's on the right-hand side or the left-hand side for you, but in fact, there may be a series of like 3 dots, one on top of the other, boom, 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 that you click on, and it kind of gives you more options. It's like a little menu. That might be on the right-hand side. But anyway, look for one that says Share Screen, and then you click on that, and then I think it asks you if you want to share your entire screen. That's what you want to do.
I see screen share.
That's it.
Okay. Okay, so now I'll go to, do you see the Arctic Ocean map?
No, you still haven't shared the screen effectively yet.
Oh, okay. Let me see. Share, okay.
Okay, now we're getting somewhere. So now go ahead and move it to the Arctic Ocean map.
Okay, you see the Arctic Ocean map?
Yep. Now we see it. Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not going to quote Paul Beckwith, but my understanding was that if you look up here at the Bering Sea, you see, where the land bridge used to be, and it's a narrow area. And of course, water flows from the Atlantic Ocean and all around here, and up, all around Greenland, the Atlantic Ocean through here, and from the Pacific around here. And his idea was that somehow we can block the ice, which is floating, from escaping through this passage. That would help alleviate or help, keep the ice in the area, which should help keep it cooler. So that's another method to think about.
So basically, you're talking about blocking the ice from escaping by floating out through such passages as the former land bridge, right?
Correct. And let me see if I can get off this screen share.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me go back to the screen where we have kind of the main ways of refreezing the Arctic. Let me screen share back to that. So we've talked about human-made reflecting systems. Another way that Adam just mentioned was blocking ice from, I'll just say, escaping, floating away. Okay, that's another contributing way of refreezing the Arctic. And another, since we're talking big, broad categories at this point, I'll say another would be blocking warm ocean currents from hitting the ice, hitting and melting. Okay, so on this screen we'll have kind of the high level ways, and then here we delve into reflection. We've talked about 4 different ways of reflecting away the sunlight. Adam then talked about a way, I'll just put this on here, blocking the floating ice from escaping. And so one way of doing that is, I'll just put here, like, you've got Nome, Alaska, and you've got whatever the peninsula is on the Siberian side, basically building some sort of a structure, some sort of a fence, right? Effectively, a wall, a barrier, to keep the ice from floating away, chunks of ice from floating away that way. So, okay, wanted to memorialize that, and then let's bring up another screen for deflecting / blocking warm ocean currents. And that's where we're talking about the Arctic ice as sort of this buffer or bank account. So you can imagine, if you've got the ocean water here, you have the Arctic ice here, which of course most of it is under the surface of the ocean. And so the basic issue is, you've got these warm ocean currents coming from the south with warm ocean water, and that basically, you know, breaks away. It melts away the ice as the warm water hits it. You know, so the idea is of creating some kind of a barrier, and I've kind of hypothesized that maybe we could make some sort of a seawall or something like that, where we anchor it below with appropriate methods. The ocean floor in the Arctic Ocean is not terribly deep, so anchoring it from below is a possibility, and then anchoring it above onto the ice, for example, with some sort of a structure, and just using, I mean, this could even be done with sufficiently strong fabric. There's this whole class of fabrics called geotextiles, which are very strong, durable materials. And so as long as we create a sufficiently strong and sufficiently supported curtain, right, we can block that, we can deflect away that warm ocean seawater, simply not let it cool off by melting the Arctic ice. Now, of course, one would have to explore what are the unintended consequences of, I'll just put over here, unintended consequences. And that's really a key thing that needs to be considered for whatever approach that we're looking at it and evaluating. What are the unintended consequences of doing that? The intended consequence is to refreeze the Arctic ice. But what are the unintended consequences? And whatever those unintended consequences may be, we need to balance those against the predicted consequence of losing the Arctic ice. You know, if we, to quote the president of Finland, if we lose the Arctic, we lose the planet. So, you know, part of me says we need to defend the Arctic ice and refreeze the Arctic, you know, at all costs. But then, of course, we always need to be cognizant of the unintended consequences and look at it holistically. So whatever action we're contemplating, we need to look at all the effects and say, okay, so net, is it a net positive, or is it a net negative, or is it net neutral? Anyway, I'm going to go on mute to hear folks' thoughts.
Yeah, I just want to, you know, you're bringing up the problem of the warm ocean currents essentially destroying the, you know, depth of the ice. And that's been going on. You know, and when we come to the time factor, how long, with any of these interventions, assuming they can be implemented, what is the time factor? Because it seems like it's very important to sort out various interventions according to the time factor. Because if we have these self-reinforcing feedback loops that have been, you know, increasing with an exponential kind of a function, really only probably for about 10, 12 years, you know, has this even been really happening the way it is unfolding. So, you know, if part of the problem is, for example, you know, Jennifer Francis, the climatologist, I think she's at Rutgers now, you know, her hypothesis is that the decrease in the differential between the, you know, polar mass of air and the air, which is, I guess, wherever you start kind of the subtropical or tropical mass of air, you know, and the jet stream in the northern latitudes, you know, kind of separates these two areas. And when that differential between those air masses becomes less and less, then the jet stream slows down, it starts to meander, you know, it becomes much more wavy in terms of, you know, the amplitude, et cetera. And so what that apparently, according to her hypothesis, and others have, you know, Peter Wadhams believes it's a rational hypothesis, then what you have is, and I think it also could have an effect on the movement of ocean currents. But what it definitely has an effect on is the tropical warm air going up into the Arctic and the cold polar mass of air being, drawn down into areas of the country like Chicago, right, of late. So that's something which is continuing to happen. And the faster that the Arctic could be refrozen is a real factor. And when you, and Peter Wadhams brings up, I think, a pretty relevant insight when he talks about climatologists, the scientists, and that in a normal situation where you'd be having linear change as opposed to exponential change, he points out that scientists like to essentially go by the null hypothesis. Essentially any changes we're seeing are just kind of random. We haven't seen it for a long enough period of time to be able to really conclude there's a connection here. It's for real. And so we don't have time for that normal kind of thing to occur. We probably can't afford to have 20 or 30 years of observations of weather weirding, et cetera, before you can actually get beyond the null hypothesis. And so it is critical, the timing. It seems, and also just to mention that if it's not possible to do this, there's other strategies which could be implemented. I know Peter Wadhams mentions, some form of fracking to start to extract the methane out. I mean, the methane gas, which is frozen in the ocean up there and in the tundra areas, around the Arctic Ocean. This is what will really kick things off in a way where we're not going to be able to, survive. So I do think that, whatever interventions we're taught, I know cost is an issue. I know feasibility, cannot really be done. But I think the timing is really important. That's the thing I just want to highlight, underline here. We need interventions that somehow could be implemented in a very short period of time. And you may have some thoughts on that, Jamin. I'm going to mute out.
I have some thoughts. The Arctic it is extremely critical, and we all know that. It seems to me that what we need to do is hire a contractor like Halliburton or somebody, huge, and have them go up there and start deploying whatever method they can. That we've already mentioned some. I imagine that numerous amounts of methods would be used wherever they were as most practical. And so I was just reading a place on physics. It's called physics.org or something like that. And it was mentioning like a $3.8 trillion cost to refreeze the Arctic, which apparently is only 13% of the U.S. GDP. And I guess the worldwide GDP is like 78 trillion. But it boils down to, if we want to do this, it's an emergency, a global emergency. I mean, it just seems like we need to hire a contractor that will go up there and get the work done.
Yeah, in fact, if I were the head of one of the big, multi-billion-dollar engineering companies, and years ago when I was actually still an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, I worked for one of the biggest, which was Bechtel, which is headquartered in San Francisco. So if I were Riley Bechtel, the head of Bechtel, it's a family-run, family-owned business, actually. It's one of the bigger privately held companies in the world. If I were Riley Bechtel, knowing what Jamin Shively knows, and I might give Riley a call to just tell him. But if I were Riley Bechtel, I would be sending ships to the Arctic right now to be doing, pilot tests and prototypes and putting out a lot of noise about it and saying, okay, you hear a lot of noise about climate change, right? Here's a company that's actually doing something about it. Now, of course, that would cost money, probably tens of millions of dollars to do some exploratory expeditions and some piloting. But what Bechtel could do in really taking the lead is to say, look, we're going to send a bill to the federal government to pay for this. And, it may take the federal government a while to wake up and actually pay the bill. But we can't wait. We cannot wait. The world cannot wait, right? So we need some sort of campaign like the world cannot wait. So private companies, nonprofits, whatever institutions, even smaller governments. But we need to form basically a coalition of the willing to, get our heads out of our butts and do something about this. Now, take some bold moves, right? Bechtel's got the money. They're billionaires. They could totally, afford a few tens of millions of dollars of, exploratory prototyping and testing. But you see what a splash they could make in terms of PR. I mean, that would be big news, right? I mean, wouldn't you guys be pretty impressed if a private company based in San Francisco, Bechtel, were to take the lead like that? I'm just putting out ideas. See, now we're talking actually at a different level. Go ahead, Adam.
Well, it's not only the United States that would help pay. I'm sure the rest of the world would join in. And if I said billion, I meant it was 3.8 trillion.
Oh, I got it. Yeah. No, well, I mean, anyway, so let's say Bechtel sends a bill to all the major governments of the world and says, look, we've divvied this up, in 5 ways. Please do your part, right? But I think it's going to take some bold moves like that. I mean, here we are doing, basically high-level whiteboard analysis of what are the different options. But to really get serious about this, we're going to need to do some pretty heavy-duty computer modeling to actually to be able to answer Dan's questions of time frame. How long would it take, and what would the impact be, and what would the cost be? All this needs to be modeled, which is a fancy way of saying estimating those impacts by creating essentially a simulation of the whole thing. So I think we need to model and simulate a number of different methods and strategies and see what the data shows us. Right? Where are we going to get the most bang for buck? What's going to be the safest? What's going to have the least unintended consequences, etc.?
I think the time frame is now. I mean, it's very likely that the Arctic ice will be gone this summer, and there's a huge difference. It's like Professor McPherson says. It's like holding a glass of ice water. As long as that ice is in the water, the temperature stays down around freezing. But as soon as the ice melts, the water goes through a rapid increase in temperature. So all those oceans flowing into the Arctic, when the ice is gone, the energy, the heat energy from those oceans is currently melting the ice. But when the ice is gone, it will start mixing in with the Arctic ice water, and it will reach an equilibrium temperature rapidly, and then our air conditioner will be gone. So and you can't, you know, it's be a whole lot harder to try and freeze the Arctic after it's totally melted. So the time frame is now, and I think you're right. You know, if Bechtel is a private company, then yes, we should be trying to get a hold of them and alerting them. Maybe this Riley person isn't aware. I doubt it. He probably is, but he might not be. And other companies too that are publicly owned. I mean, we should think about how we can encourage stockholders to start writing letters to the CEOs and saying, "Hey, we got to do something about this, or I'm going to pull my stock out." You know, that's a way of coercing people. If we're going to go the route of using money, then we're going to have to do it. We're going to have to use money and try and solve this problem.
If I could, I know we only have a few minutes left for this portion. I think, you know, this winter, it's been kind of noted that warm temperatures have still been up there in the Arctic, above and below. And even though it's winter, so there is no radiative energy coming from the sun. And that tells you, in a sense, that we probably do need, you know, some sort of something to deal with the albedo, you know, to artificially create that. But we also have to note that, you know, during the winter, even though there hasn't been any sunlight beating down, there's still been major problems coming from the warm ocean currents getting through, possibly, and the warm air, because of the jet stream now slowed down, buckling, and that's allowing warm air to get up to the Arctic, and ocean currents are hitting the Arctic, you know, from below the ice. And so I think the time is really critical, because if something isn't done right away to sort the stuff out and figure out what can we do, I mean, the money clearly could be brought into play. Theoretically, there's enough money in the world, you know, one way or the other, to probably do what's necessary. To get that money is, you know, brings up a whole bunch of problems, but that's there. But I'm really concerned about the time. You know, how much time do you have before these self-reinforcing feedback loops basically sweep any interventions away? I mean, I was even thinking, Jamin and the rest of you guys, I was thinking, you know, when you're talking about, you know, the way that the geo shading would be put in place, you know, I was thinking, well, you know, if we're going to have these massive, you know, much stronger storms, you know, with horrific wind levels and everything, you know, how stable does it have to be, and what's involved in that kind of a thing. So I do think that, you know, definitely a lot of thought needs to be put into the variables that really go into the necessity, I would say, to refreeze the Arctic in a very short period of time. So I'm done. I'm muting out.
Totally. No, really good points, gentlemen. Yeah, and as to your, you know, point about all the different variables, Dan, that's another reason why we need to do all this modeling. We need to model it and not just go up there and have a big flop. In fact, it was precisely thinking about the wind and all those factors that I went from, you know, touting blimps as, you know, the solution to suspend the thin film, to bring it down to buoy suspended, where you'll have, you know, a lot lower wind speeds. And also you can create wind breaks, right? Maybe, you know, windmills to both absorb wind and generate electricity, but then actual wind breaks to protect the thin film reflective material. Anyway, lots of ways to do it, a lot of sophistication that can be brought in. But you know, as Adam and Dan were both pointing out, the time is now. We don't have time to wait. And so, you know, one of the big things we need to figure out is how do we expand this conversation, and how do we get a lot of people, thousands, millions of people participating in the collective intelligence, cranking up the heat on this very topic, spreading the word, and reaching out to government representatives, reaching out to private sector, to media, through social media, through, you know, whatever means we have. But we need to get people talking about this, paying attention, and participating in the conversation. So go ahead, Adam. And we're just about out of time.
Right. A contractor like Bechtel, a big giant contractor, will look at this as a package deal, and he will hire subcontractors and do modeling, and if he has to do it fast, he'll employ what he has to get the job done quickly. It seems to me that this is the situation we're in. We need a giant contractor to go up there and get the job done. And so I haven't heard of anybody, of any contractor doing this. And it boils down to offering up it seems like the world, the United States or some government should be offering up a contract for a contractor to go up there and do it. But that doesn't seem to be happening. So it just seems to me that one of the things that maybe we could do is try to contact, solicit information on how we can get a hold of these contractors, and how we can get a hold of the right people to initiate solicit a bid, get the thing going, and have it in, put it out in the Wall Street Journal and say, we need a big contractor to go refreeze the Arctic. And we have a bunch of different plans, and we need you to look at it and see what's going to be done where, and what the subcontractor. This is a global emergency. It needs to happen now, and we will pay whatever it takes.
I love it, Adam. In fact, based on what you just said, I would like to put out a call to anyone who watches this video. If you have any contacts with any of the big engineering firms around the world, please send this video. Please send a link to this video to those contacts that you have and invite them into the conversation. You can say, I'm writing on behalf of Jamin Shively, who has asked me to contact you regarding this planetary emergency and opportunity where we need your leadership. So engineering companies of the world, contractors of the world, please step up, join us, and join this conversation so that we can work together and figure out a way to get this started. We just need to figure out how to start. We don't necessarily need to figure out all the steps, but the very next steps we need to figure out. So we'll take that up next time. We'll be meeting on a weekly basis to continue this conversation of refreezing the Arctic. So come one, come all. We need everyone to join this conversation and pitch in and do your part in promoting the urgency of this to contractors, to government, etc. All right. And with that, we're at the top of the hour, a couple of minutes past actually. So let's adjourn this, and then I will start a whole new hangout, which I'll send out to you all and everyone on the list. On radical collective intelligence will be the next topic that we'll discuss in the next hour. So please look out in your email for the link to that, and I hope to see you all on the next hour. We'll kick that off in about 5 minutes. See you all soon. Thank you so much. We'll see you on the next one. Arigato.